Somebody would rather, buy a Mercedes than hire a CFO when you're at that level. And I can tell you the CFO is going to buy you 10 Mercedes later, right?
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Flywheel Effect. We're sponsored by Vital. Vital is your partner that helps you grow your business, become more profitable, and learn how to work on your business instead of in your business. So if you're a home integrator, commercial integrator, looking to level up, give Matt a call.
We have a website, growwithvital.com, where you can get more information.
Yeah. So we have a guest with us today, and it's Gary Rabishaw, Managing Director at Intrepid, a investment bank. And Gary focuses on call it custom electronics, the CEDIA space, selling consumer electronics and other related products and helping companies either sell or buy other competitive products. Now, Gary, how's it going?
It's going great. Thank you for having me on. This is a lot of fun. And I think you kind of captured it. I think I'm probably maybe a bit of a unicorn as an investment banker who has done a lot of CEDIA deals and sort of focuses in on the space. And great. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, Gary, we've been sort of connected for now it's over 20 years because you sold SpeakerCraft back in 2005, which I was involved in that. Yeah,
hard to believe. 20 years has gone by since then, and I think I've been to maybe 18 CEDIAs since, and I think I missed last year. It was the first time in about 10 years, so looking forward to getting back to Denver in September.
Yeah, CEDIA's having its issues right now as a show. With was it Avixa bought? I think they bought the show from Emerald, and they bought Lightapalooza. There's something right there, I think. But it's going to be interesting what happens to CEDIA as a show over the next few years.
Yeah, I heard rumblings of that. I was out at InfoComm the last couple days, and a lot of those companies and integrators overlap both markets. And there was some talk about that. I think there's maybe kind of a mutiny happening in the industry against CEDIA. Hopefully it stays intact or somehow merges seamlessly into another show. And, I think it's an important venue for manufacturers, for the integrators, and for those of us who are also around the industry to get together with a lot of people at once. So hopefully that stays intact.
For the listeners who may not know, CEDIA is a trade organization for custom integrators, but also they have an expo every year, which is the big trade show. I don't know, it's been 20 plus years at least. And then InfoComm is a separate trade show for commercial audio video. So CEDIA Expo has been residential. InfoComm, which just happened this week in Las Vegas, is commercial. So those are some of the different shows that we're talking about. A lot of changes happening.
Yeah. How was InfoComm, Gary?
I thought it was actually really well done. It seemed like there was quite a bit of attendance. You can just get a feeling on the floor at just the amount of people milling about. And it seemed like there's a lot of enthusiasm on the commercial side. I think most of those companies are doing decently well. Obviously, the last couple of years have been challenging with tariffs and a lot of the things that are impacting both the residential and the commercial kind of tech hardware world. But it seems like the need for technology in buildings, the advances in innovation that are changing the way things are done, whether it's AI or software technology that's enabling kind of virtualization of hardware, formerly hardware equipment, is really getting people excited. And I think they'll have to lean in. It's not as simple as just buying boxes and connecting them anymore. And I think a lot of people are digging into that sort of educational side. And so I went to some interesting events on that, and there's a lot of really interesting advances happening here.
Yeah. I think like 25, I guess my first CEDIA was in 1999. And since then it's transitioned, and it's similar to InfoComm. It's transitioned from, as you said, connecting boxes, a very hardware focused shows, to now it's hardware plus the software that allows these products to interconnect, communicate, and provide a more cohesive service. And I think that change into more of a software enabled hardware is actually and it's just kind of happened, right? Like it seems like we've been talking about it forever, but now it's really here.
That's right. I think, for years. And AI is kind of the similar thing, I would say. We've now been talking about software as a service in residential and commercial AV for a long time, and it's absolutely here front and center, and almost every company's talking about it. AI is sort of the next, people are talking about it, but I'm not sure it's really materializing into heavily productized solutions. But I do think that's only just going to happen similarly. Down the road, we'll be saying, oh, remember we were first talking about AI, and now it's here and it's involved in every aspect of the products and the solutions. the interesting thing I was asking people about is how are they using AI in their business? And it seems like there's definitely varying degrees of adoption of AI and how people are embedding it into their sort of workflows. And we're doing that similarly in our business.
So I think there's a couple of things here. I mean, with AI being embedded and being technology more embedded in hardware, I wonder from the vendor manufacturer side whether the hardware truly is going to become commoditized over the next 5 or 10 years, where it becomes interchangeable because it's just really ultimately the software layer that only matters. And you think about like Windows computers, desktop computers, they are essentially interchangeable hardware for 90% of the use cases out there. And the margins just got crushed. I don't know if you've got a sense that maybe the same thing is happening across the hardware landscape, or if there's still going to be ways to differentiate on the hardware side.
Well, I still think the hardware is always going to have a place to enable these things, but the form factors of, say, like a microphone, for instance, they went from tabletop, if you think about a corporate environment, from tabletop wired devices sitting in front of you, then it was sort of devices in the ceiling, and now it's just going to be more like a Wi-Fi router sort of hanging on the wall that's going to capture audio and with a bunch of software able to sort of connect that to video and reference it. And I saw some pretty interesting innovation in that area. And so you don't have, 16 microphones anymore. You have one device, so you don't need as many channels, and you can virtualize things. So a lot of that seems to be really happening now in real time. And so where you might need 4 servers or 4 multi-channel devices, now you need one and you can virtualize others around it. So there's definitely that software removing the need for hardware, but hardware still has a role, I think, in all these cases.
Hey, Gary, what I'm finding fascinating about what you're sharing is you're a banker, and yet you know a lot about technology and probably a lot about a lot of things. Let's talk about your history, your background. How did you get to where you are today? What is a banker? What's an investment banker do? So let's back up. Like, what was Gary like in high school? Did he want to be a banker? Like, where'd you grow up? Tell us a little bit about your history.
Absolutely. That's a great question. And anyways, I'm from Chicago, grew up in the suburbs there, moved out to LA about 26 years ago last week to join a boutique mergers and acquisition firm. Was a suburban kid, went to high school, had jobs all through high school, was always kind of a gadget person, music, AV. But when I was remembering sort of trying to draw some links to how I ended up an investment banker focused on AV, my dad, when I was a kid, actually owned a retail store in the suburbs that was selling the original Betamax and the original VHS and the original Magnavox video disc and all these things. And I used to go hang out there all week. And this is when Intellivision and ColecoVision, all these things were coming out. And I would just hang around the store and play the video games and help customers sort of show them how they work. And one interesting story is we were right by the Chicago Bears practice facility. So often after practice, all these like famous Chicago Bears, Walter Payton, Vince Evans, Virgil Livers, all these guys from the wow, I guess late 70s, early 80s, and they would come in and we'd show them how to play video games, and show them what in these games Atari was, and so I don't know if there's some DNA there that led me to kind of love this space. And just I'm a musician, I'm an audiophile, I love to see a million live concerts. I just love the stuff, so it's easy for me to bring that passion of the technology to what I do, and in banking. And so how I ended up here, I was never really thinking, hey, I want to be an investment banker. I didn't even know what an investment banker was, in high school, and probably not even mostly through college. It wasn't until I went to business school. I went to Northwestern after graduating from the University of Illinois, and I had been working in commercial banking and had an instructor that was sort of a former investment banker. And I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. We're lending money to companies, but these deals and how to think about starting businesses and owners and entrepreneurship and, what's going through their mind. And when I got an opportunity to join my predecessor firm, which was the firm that worked on SpeakerCraft, was called Barrington Associates in LA. I was in Chicago and ended up getting connected to this group in Los Angeles and came out and joined this small firm. And the firm was a generalist. Most investment bankers 20 years ago, there weren't these industry silos. You didn't have to know as much about industries. You really just had to know how to do a deal and how to advise an owner and sort of, how to deal with buyers. If you've done enough of that, you could get hired. And the question was, hey, what size deal do you do and what's a normal situation? Now it's, what's your industry focus? So in the last 15 years, that's been the evolution of our industry. So you have to be industry first if you're going to do sizable deals and get to be a known commodity. So I joined the firm Barrington Associates, and that firm was acquired in 2006 by Wells Fargo Bank. And a bunch of us stayed and worked part of Wells. And then in 2010, a handful of us left to form Intrepid. Today we're 120 people. We're a national firm. We actually went through another sale ourselves. And so,
congratulations.
Thank you. That was back in 19, and all the partners are still here. So it's a really cool culture place. But as we were developing Intrepid, we said, hey, everybody's got to kind of have an industry that they focus on. It's really important if you want to become a real national firm doing larger deals. And so I'd done the SpeakerCraft deal. We had sold Polk Audio. We had sold Ultimate Ears. We had done all these deals in consumer electronics, and I just love the stuff. And so I said, I'm going to do that. I'm just going to kind of dive in and add to that the music industry, where I've done a lot of transactions, the NAM world, if you think about it in terms of trade shows. And it's just one of these things where, especially in these small industries like CEDIA, we did SpeakerCraft, and immediately our phone was ringing, hey, we have a company like this. Why don't you come and talk to us? And that happened with Polk Audio, led to UE, which led to selling Blue microphones, which is more of a kind of a podcaster. You guys might use Blue microphones. And it just steamrolled, and that's been 20 years of that. And so then we've leaned into these sectors, and I have every trade magazine coming every day, sound and video and CE Pro and everything. And I read the stuff because it's personally interesting. So that's allowed me to really get to know. I don't need to know how to build a speaker, but I better know who's doing what in the industry. And so you got to stay close tabs. And since they're both passion projects and interesting industries, that's led me to kind of build, as you said, kind of a little bit of the technical knowledge. I couldn't explain how anything is done, but I can observe what's happening and kind of explain it to people. And the importance of that, too, is when you sit with companies, and this is, I think, important for your listeners, if you're either a manufacturer or an integrator, is sort of like, what are buyers looking for, right? That's what I'm always trying to find out, especially in an industry like this where I know all the large players, everybody kind of who's acquiring. And then I try to get to know the great earlier stage companies, smaller businesses, 10, 20, 50, $100 million sales. And then I'll play matchmaker and say, oh, I know you have this and you're developing this capability. I know this large company industry is looking for that. Let's get a conversation going. And that may or may not lead to a deal, but it builds goodwill and relationships. And then those things kind of eventually flow back to you in terms of business and people hiring you.
Oh, that's awesome. I appreciate that, Gary. What a cool arc, I guess.
It's been a cool journey. Yeah.
It sounds like you fell into something you're really passionate about.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Lucky
I
in
can see it. Yeah, I can see it on your face when you're talking about it. So that's really great.
The cool thing is you hear that from a lot of people in this industry, right? Like in the CEDIA electronics world, there is a level of passion around it. I think it's just because music and video are so visceral. And even though we're selling boxes or selling services, the end game is people's enjoyment. And that's a pretty cool place to be.
Very true. I mean, that's what keeps it interesting. You hear, we've sold so many companies to start with. I had this idea and it was this need in the market, and I started in my garage, and then it was my parents' extra bedroom, and then we got a small warehouse, and then it became something bigger. And those are the stories that we tell to buyers, and that's what gets people excited about it. Even going back to SpeakerCraft, Jeremy's story with the building the first in-wall speaker and how to deal with integrators, and the way of thinking about them as their needs and personal goals, and think about the business. I think Jeremy said you need to be unique, better, or different, or something. He had a real interesting moniker. We'd bring him in to meet our team because he was such a great salesperson. But yeah, that passion is critical, right? Because these jobs aren't easy. Crawling through attics is not easy. Building and selling in highly competitive markets with tariffs and all the noise around it is not easy. So if you don't have the passion, you're not going to last very long. There's probably easier things to do in life than the AV industry or investment banking for that matter.
Yeah. I'd love to get your feedback on something, Gary, because I think you just brought up something that's so critical, especially for the small business, which is the story, right? I'd love to lean on your experience here for our listeners. You sell businesses for a living, right? Essentially, or play matchmaker. You're involved in a lot of transactions. How important is the story of the business to the success of the business, the growth of the business, and ultimately an exit?
Well, I think it's critical. Telling the right story to the person who wants to hear it in the right way is the important part, because the story is a little different. It can be different, right? You can tell the same story different ways depending on who's on the other side of the table. If you're talking to a private equity firm, wants to buy your business and be a platform company and then go out and do other acquisitions, that's a story, right? And then you talk about, we have the infrastructure, we have all these targets that we want to go buy. Here's the size of our market. Here's how we're winning. We've done a couple deals already and they've gone really well, and boom, that's our story, right? And then there's the story of, hey, we have this great brand and, we've taken as far as we can get it, but if we plug into your business and your distribution, this is the ultimate ear story. We had a visionary roadie from Van Halen who started an in-ear monitor business, ended up getting becoming a branded wired audio business. And they took it to a certain size and kind of said, hey, look, we've kind of gone as far as we think we can go with it. But Logitech, if you buy it and plug it into your system, you could be 5X what we are, like that. And so, understanding that is important. The personal story is one I think that is also important. Like, why did we get into this business? What was the solution we were looking for? What was missing? Sometimes those stories, if they get too personal around the individual, can also cut against you, right? Because if I'm the buyer and I'm saying, okay, well, every story this guy's told started with I and I and I. But then it's, whoa, okay, I'm going to give this guy a bunch of money. He's going to go to the beach and we're going to be left kind of holding the bag. So like I said, understanding that story and then being able to articulate it to the right audience in the right way, the two have to go hand in hand.
Love that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think that personal story is something that kind of, as you said, cuts both ways. You've seen a lot of acquisitions over the years where the original owner brand had a great personal story, connection to the industry, connection to customers, but then institutional buying comes in. And over time, that gets lost. Like SpeakerCraft sold it to Nortec. Nortec had a bunch of brands, Niles, Lon, what have you, but don't necessarily keep the same passion project over the next 20 years. And I think that's the piece that people worry about as integrators, because they have long memories.
It is a great point, and that's always one of the top reticence of buyers, right? There's some buyers who steamroll right through it. We don't care. Our culture, it can bring this business through. Others say, gosh, that risk that we're buying a highly entrepreneurial culture and we could screw it up is a major, especially when you're dropping a lot of money for a company. I'll tell our personal story. We sold, our first company I mentioned was bought by Wells Fargo Bank, and then they made another acquisition and everything changed. And so we left. It was actually a great match to start. And so when we were getting to 50 or 75 people at our firm, we said, hey, we liked being owned by a commercial bank because it gave us a lot of resources that we didn't have, clients, capital, the ability to go hire more people, kind of that competitive advantage. And we ended up selling to a group called MUFG, which is Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, which is actually a $7 trillion bank. And the history of investment banks getting bought by banks is not a great one because of what we're just describing. Banks come in, it's too heavy culture, our way. And so we did it with Wells, and it actually worked quite well until they made another acquisition that had an investment bank in it. They merged two investment banks we kind of felt like it just wasn't our thing. But in this second time, and this is, I think, good advice for people when you think about who to sell to, we were talking to this commercial bank, and the guy who ran North America was a former middle market investment banker, just like us. He knew exactly what Intrepid was, which was a really entrepreneurial, high energy, culture first, driven people, no BS, no bureaucracy kind of place. And the worst thing that could happen, and you can imagine not many people describe a $7 trillion Japanese bank with any of those adjectives. And he knew that. And they're a great company and a wonderful business, but when you get to a very entrepreneurial team, he said, look, we understand we're going to be hands off. And if you look at our business card, if you look at our offices, you don't really see a lot of MUFG here. They bring the resources, but they say your culture, we want to import your culture into our organization. And we'd spent a lot of time up front talking about that with the CEO of North America, who we were going to be working with directly. He said, look, I've seen the movie. I know how we can screw these things up. The worst thing that happens is 24 months later, you guys are all pissed off and you're leaving, right? And here we are 7.5 years later, and all 7 of us who are original founding partners are still with the firm. So if you wire it right and you get the right partner and you kind of set the expectations up front and people live by that, it can actually be very powerful. But I think we're maybe a little bit an outlier in the way that it's worked out.
Yeah, those integrations are hard, no matter what the acquisition is.
Yeah. It's different. I think we're a people business, so you can keep it separate. If you're manufacturing products, I think there's a lot of, I would say, larger electronics companies that are kind of known as companies that screw up the brands that they buy. I'm not going to get into who maybe that fits in that bill. Everybody's got their own perspectives. But because it's hard to keep a brand separate when you have to take over manufacturing and sourcing and all the different aspects of the business, that it wouldn't make sense to not take over it. If you can do that part well, but keep the front end separate and keep the cultures separate, you can have a lot of success. And there's tons of, I think, history of that happening too, but maybe equally or more, there's the ones where you kind of lose that culture, what made it special, and then you're just sort of another brand in a portfolio, figuring out where you fit.
I love that, Gary. And I think high level, when for the listeners here who are at that level, it makes perfect sense. I'd love to take that lesson and apply it to the contractor business, right? When we think about the contractor business, maybe they'll never sell to private equity, maybe they'll never talk to an investment banker, but what you just described absolutely lands for them, which is really, it's a unique selling proposition. What is the soul of that organization, and ensuring that no matter what happens over time, the soul of that organization remains such that their customer base is happy, their employees are happy, and they attract A players. So just wanted to kind of double down on that. I don't know if there's anything to add, but I wanted to ground it a little bit for some of the contractors that might be listening.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, no matter what your business is, we're just contractors. We're people who come in and out of an office. It's all people, but we have our guiding principles on culture, on how we treat our customers, on how we treat each other, what we expect, and that's never changed, whether we've been owned by a big bank or whether it's been the partnership who started the firm. And so that's very much led by the top down. We all preach it daily. It gets harder when you're at 120 people, frankly, to keep it all uniform. But every day we're working at that, and that's part of our Monday morning meeting with the whole firm. We're reiterating what's important to us and how we handle situations. And I think you're right. That culture is super important, and it starts with the leader and the team. And it gets harder and harder as you scale. Do it. You got to kind of lean in heavier as you grow.
Yeah, it can be. I love how you described that. My experience has been that as you grow, the culture and soul can be challenged because maybe it's a little fragile to begin with, or if it's not fragile, if it's strong, there's questions about whether that soul and that culture can grow to where we want, or does it have to change in order to get to where we want to go? I don't know if that makes any sense, but that
is a great point. And I mentioned we were 7 people who came from a firm that was built starting in the 80s. It was bought by a bank. And at first we started and everything was kind of 2.0 of what we had already been doing. And we ourselves realized, hey, that's only to get us so far. And we're all sort of homegrown mentalities, and we all have this kind of things to fall back on that worked previously. But you're right, that's not going to get you to be bigger or change your way or adapt to the market changing. And so I mentioned like this industry thing. That was a big step culturally because really nobody was industry bankers initially. And so we all said, hey, you got to do this. You got to really lean in, pick the lane. And then we started recruiting people from the outside who were senior people at other banks like us, or ones that we maybe aspire to look like. And so you end up bringing in ideas. And if you're too hung up on being dogmatic about this is our way, and then you start bringing in more people, then you're going to have real clashing, right? Because our view is always tell us what worked at your organization and let's figure out how to bring that into our organization. It's not easy for people to do that, and it's not easy to accept it even when you say you want it. It's like a lot of barriers have to overcome. And now we have 5 offices, 6 offices, and historically we were 1 office. So we also got to say, okay, we want our New York office culture to be its culture as well within what we're doing. So if you have multiple locations, satellite teams, it's okay if you have different cultures as long as they sort of, the banner of culture is consistent. And so, yeah, it's a lot to manage.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When you were looking at you transition into more industry, I think that it lines up with the growth of the internet, basically, Gary, right? Like, it used to be that bankers were local. Your specialty was your geography.
Yeah.
And especially the good ones, like you guys, Barrington and Intrepid are great bankers. Your footprint geography-wise, based on how buyers operate and how you communicate via the internet, has become national. So how can you, if your specialty is no longer geography, if you're national, the only way you can specialize really is via industry, and kind of the recognition of how the structural change of the way the world operates kind of forced your hand.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, historically, our business was we'd get out into the market here. We would meet all the lawyers, accountants, and wealth managers we could, try to get referrals to their clients who were also kind of local businesses, and now they're ready to sell. And it's okay, they're going to pick firm A, B, or C. You're meeting them basically at the altar, and they're picking you or not, right? And we, over time, if I'm going to go to trade shows, and this, I think, drove a bit as well about how we've organized the firm. Over time, we've added more services because the philosophy was we want to meet companies earlier. We don't want to get called in at the 11th hour when they're already going to pick banker A, B, or C. And if we don't know them yet, probably that somebody else does, right? So our idea was, okay, I want to meet companies 1, 2, 3, 5 years before they're ready. Then we can offer to help them maybe make an acquisition, or we can help them raise debt or restructure the balance sheet or do these other services. And so we've set up ourselves that way. And it's exactly what you described, Brent. And I think for an integrator too, if they want to be the local guy in their market, then they're going to call the real estate agents and the other people who are referring to deals. But if they want to be more of a multi-region national, then same thing. You've got to be able to up-tier probably the vendors you're working with and up-tier the level of skill you have in your organization to do more complex jobs and maybe look at commercial. And I think that's where the value for an integrator, for any really business that's kind of within CEDIA exclusively, to some degree, you kind of have a value cap on your business because it's a small market and relative to other markets. But if you start doing commercial, education, healthcare, whatever it is, and you're doing, maybe start to security, or you start adding shading and these other things outside of AV, which I know a lot of people are doing, and this is sort of the trend the last 5 or 10 years, that's when you start seeing these scaled groups to get to the size of being able to want to work with firms like ours and have the Bravas calling in or the Daisies or whoever looking at them and saying, okay, you've scaled up to a point where it's not just the one guy running the business, heavily relying on him. And you've got diversification of sourcing and diversification of supply and diversification of labor and maybe diversification of regions. And then you've created kind of an enterprise value outside of a sole practitioner type valuation or model.
Hey, Gary,
and we have to do the same thing. Yeah.
I think that's a great transition. I think we have a lot of business owners who listen to this in a variety of different companies and businesses, many of whom have thought about selling now or in the future. But, they're practitioners. They're not finance people. What's the role that they should think about as far as an investment bank? And 2, why? And I think 3rd is, when do you start learning about that process?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's not like a bright line where one day you are and next day you are. I would say if you're trying to build an enterprise, we always think about the term enterprise value. What is my business worth apart from what am I worth, right? Just think of like a dentist practice. A single dentist who's in his 60s can't sell his company because it's him, right? He might be able to transition his patients to the next doctor and, maybe get a small payment, but there's really no enterprise value outside of. But now you see people that own 50 dentist offices together, and they've created scale and a company and enterprise value, and they trade at good multiples. I think that just like my business, if it was just me doing this, I'd never have anything to sell, because the moment I stop working and all my tribal knowledge is gone, there's really nothing to sell. There's nothing to buy. So you have to get to a place where you have meaningful scale. Again, these things I mentioned, like you've got diversification of your revenue streams and the faucet's dripping even when you're not necessarily out there working, right? And as you think about an exit, you got to think about the company, the industry, and then your personal goals in terms of what's the right timing and am I ready and when should I start thinking about an investment banker. Most of the time you want to be earning, 3, 4, 5 million a year in profit of the business to really get somebody in our shoes to want to work with you, and for buyers to want to run a process to sell. You can always sell to the guy next region over. If you know him from a trade show and maybe you're making $1 million, $2 million, you might get a little bit, or he might just say, come join our firm and we'll pay you out, over time. But if you want to build a business that has scale and that can actually be sold as an enterprise, you kind of got to get, I would say 5 is a really good number of profit. 3 to 5, you can probably start getting some attention as an enterprise and talk about EBITDA multiples, which is what sort of governs valuation. And it's really never too early, I would say, to start figuring out if that's a goal you've set for your business. And then, I've talked to companies for 5, 10 years before they're ever ready. And even when they're way too small for us to take on. The goal is, by the time you're ready and then by the time you're of scale, if we have a relationship, maybe I've brought some ideas to you in the meantime that help you build value, or the other side of the coin is avoid potholes, don't make dumb mistakes or create structural impediments to selling your company. And then by the time you're ready, you've kind of got the relationship, you got a business that's ready, you're personally ready, and hopefully there's folks in the industry looking to buy you. And if all those stars align, then you can really create some real value.
I think when you're highlighting the scale that's required, hiring you is cheap, right? Like, I think that's why that having that scale makes sense, because now you're talking about numbers that justify the fee. But then below that, there's another world of sellers. Those are business brokers. I don't think many of our listeners really understand the difference. And from your perspective, what is the difference, and when should you consider one versus the other?
Yeah, it's a good question. You see laundromats, car washes, things like that going through business brokers, maybe a single franchise of something. And, you've got small business, somebody will take your information, put together a 2 or 3 page summary, email it out to 1,000 people and hope to get some responses. To me, that's sort of a business broker structure of how they get engaged. And, and for a lot of business owners, that makes a ton of sense. You want to pay somebody $50,000 or something to go sell your company, and you can tap into a network of buyers that they know of, maybe people who want to write $1 million check and buy a company. It's a good way to do it. And there's a spot in the market for that kind of service. If you're talking about a deal that's 20 million, 30 million, 50 million, 100 million, $1 billion, then that packaging that I described that's done at one level for a business broker is very different. The preparation, the types of firms that you can expect on the other side, it really comes down to that. Who's on the other side of the table? If it's sort of an individual that's going to write a $500,000 check, you don't need our firm to help you sell to that person. If it's a private equity firm that has $2 billion in capital and they do 10 or 15 deals a year and they're working with global law firms, then we need to be kind of armed on our side to go toe to toe with those folks and anticipate their objections, create a competitive environment. So you may remember when we were doing SpeakerCraft, we had a 50, 75 page book on the company.
Yep.
We called all the buyers, that were the relevant players, including private equity firms. I think we had 10 or 15 meetings with interested buyers. We ended up selling it to Nortec, and Nortec was a multi-billion-dollar public company, and we had the CEO sitting down with the team and did an arranged meeting and a lot of prep and rehearsing, and then the process. Then you're kind of just starting once they're interested in terms of getting all the data room information together, which is, again, mountains of information that maybe an individual at that initial size isn't going to even have. But a lot of companies, these things are hundreds of thousands of pages when you get to a good sized company and a good sized transaction. We're sort of the quarterback of that process. And we become sort of the shrink and consigliere to the owner personally, because for a lot of people, this is their first and only transaction like this. So you got to understand that mentality. Business brokers aren't going to really give you that kind of, I would say, coaching. But then also just, we have a team of 4 or 5 people helping with all this information gathering and preparation, and our fees are in the millions, so a certain size deal, as you said, Brent, we're just going to be, not the right tool. And we know that, it's not like we're not everything to everybody. We kind of know where we fit. But if you have a scaled company and you're looking for kind of white glove service, soup to nuts, from the moment you decide you want to do it to the moment you're hopefully waking up and your bank account is 50x larger than it was the day before, that's when you need a firm like ours to do that. And then you can also bring in multiple parties to look at it as well. Like if you're trying to sell it with a broker or even yourself, you can't talk to 30 parties and have all these people reviewing the information and then, responding on a bid deadline and all the things that are part of our process. It's just much harder to do when you're trying to either do it yourself or work with somebody who is maybe a smaller firm or doesn't have the skill and the scope to do that.
Yeah, I think that quarterbacking is really critical, because I think if you're a business owner, even if you're a fairly large one, you got to focus on your business, right? Like a sale is a completely separate process that is outside the daily operations of your business. And if you're not focused on your business while you're focused on 6 months, a year to sell, that could fall flat. And I think having that separation and having professionals handle one lends a ton of value. I think you also, having competitive process is probably the number one determinant of higher valuations than I think anything else.
Yeah, it certainly has an effect. And the people always say, what's the top thing that could go wrong when a deal doesn't happen. And it's precisely what you said, Brent, which is, and look, it may not be the cause, but the company does not perform to expectations, right? We tell a buyer we're going to make 10 million, and 3/4 of the way through the deal, you're all of a sudden you're trending towards 6 million. Well, you're playing defense from there out, right? And you're hoping they don't walk away, and you're begging them to just sort of, okay, well, give us a discount and maybe we'll take the deal, or we're going to pull it off market and wait till we get back to 10 and go back out. So that when we've looked over years of stats of the deals we take on, and the biggest reasons, and when you look back at why deals didn't close, that's number one, the company misses numbers. Two is the financial organization of the company was not sufficient to withstand a process. And that's where I think, again, thinking about what small business owners can do to scale their business, we often joke that somebody would rather buy a Mercedes than hire a CFO when you're at that level. And I can tell you the CFO is going to buy you 10 Mercedes later, right? And so if you don't have a proper CFO or financial function and you sort of wing it on that department, then you show up in our office, even if you're doing 50 or 100 million, and you say, yeah, well, I have my accountant kind of comes in once or twice a week to do this, and we don't really have an ERP, we use QuickBooks, and I don't really want to get a CFO. That's a major red flag for us. The first thing we'll say is, you're not ready. Go do this and this. You're never going to withstand due diligence. As great as your business is and stuff's flying off the shelves, it almost doesn't matter, because if you can't respond, and as I talked about, let's say we have 10 parties looking at it and you're getting 10 lists of questions and they're all 30 to 80 questions long, we need bodies on the other side and experience and skill to really be able to address it. And you also probably lack the ability to project your business, right? I don't really have anybody to do projections. That's not really something we do. Again, red flag for us. So building that financial sort of house in order is critical. I think you can never be too soon to do that. But it speaks to another thing too, which we see, which is owners will come to us and say, I got to sell my company. I got to get out of this business. I'm like burnt out. I'm dead. Okay, well, tell me about your organization. Well, I do this and I do that, and every check I sign and every this, that, the other runs through me. And you spend an hour with his team and it's clear everybody defers to that owner and nobody really makes decisions. And we're like, look, man, if your goal is to get out of this organization, you got to like change everything the way you're doing it, right? Because 5 minutes in a meeting, we can put a book together that says you're the chairman, you're not really involved. But as soon as people start talking to people, it's going to become obvious that everything flows through you. And no buyer is going to say, okay, fine, we'll let you go. And, at the closing, we'll rely on your team. It's the opposite. You're going to get stuck for years. So you might as well start making those transitions. And, it's just a control thing. And obviously entrepreneurs start companies, a lot of them, because they never could work with other people, or they needed to have their own fiefdom and control. And, God bless them. They keep us afloat for decades here in our business, but they can be interesting individuals, sometimes a little click off but amazing at what they do, but not necessarily built for teamwork.
Yeah.
So
Gary, I feel either called out or seen right now. I'm not sure which one.
Two things you brought up there. One, you get these calls from sellers who say, I got to get out, right? And let's just assume their business is organized okay. But then you tell them what their business is worth, and you're saying, oh, I'm never going to sell. And then they turn around and say, oh, I'm never going to sell for that. How often do you get that? I think that overvaluation versus the market of their business.
I would say it's a constantly. It's never changed. I would say maybe it was a little more earlier in my career when I was working with companies, 3 million of EBITDA, 5 million EBITDA. They thought they were worth 50 million and, they're probably worth 25 or 30. When you get to scaled businesses, maybe there's a little more, but you still run into it. And it's always a battle, because what a company's worth is what the other person's willing to pay. And you got to let people understand that. It's not, here's how much money I need to live if I'm living off the distributions for what I sell it for, and it's got to equal what I'm making today. That's never going to work. But a lot of people think that way, like, oh, I'm going to go backwards if I sell my company. Well, yes, if risk was zero, maybe that would be the case. But if you don't see any risk in your business, you don't sell. It's like buying life insurance, saying you're mad that you died, you get the money. It's kind of that thinking. So it's a very common thing. And we spend a lot of time up front trying to vet that, because the last thing we want to do is invest a year, get great bids. We think it's a fabulous price. And the owner's like, well, this is like half of what I thought it was worth. Well, we kind of talked about that on the front end, what we thought it was worth. And you said you're good. So it is an occupational hazard that will happen from time to time. It's a little less now. I think it's another thing where the internet helps, because the idea of being outlandishly inaccurate in your value, when you can just plug it into ChatGPT and probably get some pretty good assessment of what your company's worth if you just share some data, then it's just like emotions, right? So we try to keep emotions out of it, because as soon as you get, and it's impossible, but we try, our own and our clients and the buyers, but they all creep in. But I think it is something that I would say you have to be grounded to some degree, because I'd love to say your business is worth 100 million when it's worth 60 to 70. It doesn't mean I can't find somebody to pay that much if they really want it, with the right story and all the stars aligning. And that's kind of our message. But if I'm telling you if I was you on the other side, it was my company, if I said I was never going to sell for less than 100, and I thought as the banker, there's an 80 to 90% chance that it's going to be 60 to 70 or 70 to 80, I might wait and say, here's the 3 or 4 things you can do to grow to get to your number. I can't conjure it out of thin air.
Yeah.
But I think
it's a lot like real estate, right? If you bring in a real estate broker, they walk the house and they say kitchen needs to be remodeled, you need paint outside, and all of a sudden it goes from one valuation to the next. It's not a whole lot different, right?
It's not. And it's like, what they all want to say is, my neighbor's house sold for this, so I'm worth this.
Right.
But you said it. We didn't repair the roof for 4 years. We got nothing in our product pipeline. I don't really have this finance layer that I need. I've been underinvesting in these core areas. So a buyer's going to come in and say, well, you got to add a couple $1 million of expenses here for us to really own it and do it right. Yeah. Oh, I didn't think of that. So that's the kind of stuff that we're trying to make people aware of. And look, sometimes we'll lose business or just choose not to work with clients because we're honest. I'd always rather, and this is not everybody in our industry is well known for telling you it's worth 100 if there's a 1% chance. And I'll just tell you that it's possible, and you'll hire me, and then we'll get 70 to 80, and sometimes they'll transact, and sometimes we'll get the phone call a year later and say, you were right, these guys oversold me, and I kind of know it's real, and you guys are legit, so I'm going to work with you. So yeah, but I'd rather be under promising and over delivering always.
There was one thing you brought up there, is understanding the risk in your business. And I think a lot of owners, even large company owners, in many ways view their companies as annuities, right?
Yeah.
That will never go down. But this is where a difference from real estate, right? You hold on to real estate long enough, it will go up because there's only so much land. But businesses go away all the time. And our industry is a good example of that. I think that annuity perspective is one of the biggest inhibitors to getting a proper value of the company. And it relates to like, hey, I didn't hit my numbers this year. Oh, I'm just going to do it better next year. Yeah. 50% of the time that doesn't happen, right? Like they don't go the next year. It doesn't work.
Yeah. I mean, we often joke sometimes they miss their historical numbers, like that they've told us that they did. And then we get in and like, well, you didn't really make 8 million, you made 6. And we kind of priced it off 8. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that's business. People often ask that, like, hey, aren't you like a real estate broker? I said, yeah, but kind of the price of houses isn't going to be, you have to have one buyer looking at it next to another and have a 50% difference in the price. In our business, that happens routinely. We'll send the same information to 100 parties. We'll get 10 bids. One will be 200, the other will be 60. Because people see risk differently, they see opportunity differently, synergies. You don't get that with buying a home. A home, you're probably going to be within 5 or 10%, top to bottom. And so you're right, Brent. And the other thing about what you just said is important. It was just, okay, I'll just get my numbers back. But as we all know, the future is what the buyer's buying, not the past. I mean, the past is a benchmark, but if you do 10 and then you do 7 and then you get back to 10, then it's okay. Well, what's next year? If next year is in 12, then you really haven't accomplished anything. Or if you're not growing, can't really confidently say we're going to grow. And then the more you go up in that cycle, if you miss it again, then you're sort of damaged goods. You've been out to market a couple times. So the thoughtfulness around this value conversation up front and alignment. And again, that's why I said we always evaluate 3 things. Is the company ready? And that's this sort of infrastructure, financial performance, competition. Is the market ripe? Are there buyers out there looking for this type of business? And do we think that there's going to be interest? But most importantly, is the individual ready, right? And some of these things saying, I think it's worth 100 when it's worth 50 just says you're not ready, right? They're not emotionally ready to make a decision to sell the company. And it is a heavily emotional transaction for people. I've had buyers, sellers crying at the closing. I've seen everything. If all 3 of those aren't in line, it's horrible for us to take on a project that for whatever reason doesn't close. We've invested a ton of resources. It's a year-long project. I got 4 people on it. And if we just get our retainer, it's really a bummer. And so I'm always trying to evaluate what are the things that would prohibit us from getting a deal done. And there's stuff you can control. And I think we can be objectively evaluating those first 2 pieces. Is the company ready? We can go in. We could tell you ready, or if you're not ready, here's what you need to do. Is the market ready? Yes, I can tell you, we talked to all the buyers, they'd be interested. I can't guarantee you they're going to get your price, but I know that there's going to be interest in private equity. Is the guy ready or is the woman ready who's the owner? That's always the one that's hardest to evaluate, most easily flipping from I am, I'm not. And so, and it sort of seeps out in a lot of different ways. So you have these conversations up front, you can really get a sense of somebody, if they're ready or not. And if they're not, again, even if the first two are great and we think it could be a great for us, we'd rather step away and let somebody else teach them kind of what they don't know and then come back in later. And that happens a lot.
It's interesting as you explain those, Gary. Thank you for explaining them so clearly, those three things. As you explained them, I felt like 1 and 3, so the company and the owner, would be much more tangibly, like much easier to assess than the market. But I think obviously that's from an outsider's perspective. I also spend a lot of time working with business owners. So the third piece, is the owner ready or not, for me seems very clear. But tell me the piece that I'm personally interested in, maybe others, how do you assess if the market is ready?
Yeah, it's a great question. And like, I just think about the last 2 days, right? I was at InfoComm, I had maybe 17 meetings or something. And at least 5 of those were with companies that they're never going to hire us to sell. They're $1 billion plus companies. They are the buyers of the industry, right? And we talk to them about what they're looking for and what are the holes in their product lines and what's the mood around investing. And then we've got teams here that all they do is talk to private equity firms all day. Now in the AV world, private equity is not sort of the likeliest buyer. There's just not a ton of, some of the manufacturers have been owned by private equity, and you've got a couple of these sort of integrator consolidations that are happening. But overall, when it comes to consumer electronics and tech hardware and some of the sectors where I spend a lot of time, private equity tends to devalue that sector relative to, say, personal care, beauty, food, things that are more consumable. So I'm never really basing my decisions on as private equity interested. I'm thinking, okay, here are the top 7 or 8 strategics that I know personally, and we've had recent conversations, and I know this will be a good fit for them. Whether or not they buy it, you never know. But as long as I feel like I've got some modicum of kind of recency of conversation, and sometimes, look, we'll be out talking to them, maybe on a no-names basis with a rough description of a company. If we know we're thinking potentially getting hired, we might say, hey, is this something that could fit in your roadmap? And so that's part of that industry. Being an industry banker in our world means not just knowing the sellers, but knowing the buyers.
What? And it sounds like that's your value proposition, right? Heavy on, is the company ready? And heavy on, is the market ready? And knowing the buyers and really playing that matchmaker.
Yeah, and I think maybe being in a middle market where we're selling mostly closely held businesses, the sort of psychological aspect of it, I wouldn't diminish that. That's it sounds like you do a lot of the same thing. That's a big part of what we do too, is getting them through it. And buyers pass, you talk to 100 people and you only sell it to 1. So that means 99 people probably said no. And so the emotional toll that can take on people when those start piling up and you're down to just a couple people and everybody's getting really nervous, like, oh, this is failing. And we're like, no, it's actually succeeding. We're getting to the most interested parties that have done the most work and they really want it. I can't guarantee that everyone's going to love you, but all I said was we're going to find a buyer. And so that process, as it plays out, and even my own, I would say, doing this 25 plus years, my own ability to withstand some of the ups and downs of the rejection and this client isn't getting the attention that you thought it would or whatever. I've learned my own ability to kind of control my own emotions in that situation, because we're a commission-based business and you don't close a deal, you don't get paid. And so 25 years of doing that, you figure it out. But I'm always coaching the other guys at my firm. Hey, look, the ball bounces. Every deal dies before it closes. You got to have a lot of irons in the fire, like all these metaphors. But that's an important part of it. But you're also telling that to your client, almost like, yeah. And then they know that you've seen it before, and it's not so scary. That's really what we're selling, right? That we've seen it. We've recognized patterns. We recognize buyer behavior. Plus, we know your industry. If you can deliver all of that, you become a pretty compelling option relative to competition.
Yeah. So sounds Gary, like you might have an honorary doctorate in psychology after this 25 years.
Probably. Yeah, maybe law. That's an interesting, we do a lot of this kind of stuff.
So Gary, kind of as we approach an hour here, quickly, I want to get your sense of kind of broad strokes overview of what the market does look like today as far as sales, acquisitions, consolidation. I think for 20 years, consolidation has been one of the stories that people talk about at CEDIA, and we've seen it. The show floor is smaller. That's a lot of the consolidation. But understanding what we're going to see from here on out for the next couple of years would be really interesting.
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, the last few years, sort of post-COVID, I guess we're getting into 4 or 5 years, but it still seems to be relevant. You've had demand challenges with consumer spending. You've had the housing market's been a little challenged. You've had tariffs. You've had supply chain. So a lot of things. So I would say, relatively speaking, the market's been a little slower in CEDIA land for the last 4 or 5 years. There was a whole wave of acquisitions that happened, say, up until about 2020. There's still going to be deals just because people have to sell. There's M&A. So what I think right now I'm seeing is people are, the house of brands sort of mentality, I would say, is diminished a little bit. Some of those work, some of those didn't. And you're looking now for, okay, where can I acquire capabilities? Where can I acquire technology? And so the specialization in a specific niche from a product or a software or whatever it is I think what people are looking for. They're looking to not just scale for scale's sake. And so that's, I think, probably keeps a little bit also a lid on activity. But, you know, if you have a good company that's doing something special in this industry and you're growing, particularly because not everybody's growing, I think you'll get attention in this market. And that's similar with Pro AV. And although I would say on the commercial side, it's been a little bit more robust. Like I said at the outset, I think being a CEDIA-only business is just a limiting factor that we're always encouraging people to think more broadly, whether that's a distributor, manufacturer. We haven't done too much with integrators, but I think the same applies. If you're just doing residential retrofit and new builds, you're going to be kind of range bound from a value and an interest level standpoint.
Yeah. There's a lot of buyers who don't want it, who view housing market risk and its historical cyclicality as almost a no-go within this space.
Yeah, for sure. Because yes, that's right. Unless you've sort of transitioned maybe from AV only to security. Like security, I think, is an area we've been moving our practice a little bit more into security, access control, physical security, things like that are very hot sectors right now because they're not necessarily discretionary anymore. You know, every kind of commercial, education, healthcare facility now needs security systems, and residences as well, sadly, because of the things that are going on in our country. And as well, it's just a much bigger market than straight residential, high-end residential AV. And so I would say that's a good path to move down, whether it's a product company or an integrator or a distributor of these kind of products. I think the moment you mention security to people, it opens up the aperture to who would look at it. Now, if you're 85% CEDIA and 15%, and that security piece isn't growing, you're still going to be cast as a security business, as a CEDIA business. So you got to kind of make that a strategy and have some traction over time. And I think that'll get you out of that sort of narrow bucket. But
are you moving more to the service, the various security service providers, or sticking to the hardware within the security space?
I would say we're open to both. Right now, and we closed a transaction late last year for a guard company that was guarding malls and commercial buildings. They also did CCTV implementation and monitoring. And we ended up selling it to more of a residential CCTV business because there's this convergence happening between the technology and the guarding. And the view is you want to be kind of the ability to provide both, right? Because if you're just guards, it's probably likely to diminish over time. If you're just technology, you can have a good business, but guards will always have a place. That was the thesis. And so that's led us into, I would say, a bit of each, Brent. You know, some technology companies around access control and perimeter protection and things like that. But then also, because there's a lot of, this is one where kind of leading with the market's ready, there's a ton of roll-ups happening in physical security at the moment that are private equity backed. So if you have a nice sized physical guarding company, you might have 10 suitors off the bat that are all private equity backed looking for deals. But then it's, again, capabilities of your region, or are you armed and unarmed, what do you do with your customer base? So we're moving, that also helped, I would say, in the market when tariffs were such a problem. A man guarding business has no tariff risk. It has no technology risk. It just has the risk of a guard shooting somebody accidentally. Like, that's a natural risk in that business. So we do ebb and flow. Maybe a broader question is, when consumer's a little weaker, we'll end up doing more commercial. If commercial goes soft, we'll be more in residential. And I do think that the residential side, there's some pent-up demand of owners who've wanted to sell and have been dealing with sort of issue after issue. I don't know what the next issue will be. I'm sure there will be one, but hopefully heading into the back half of this year, it'll be interesting to see around CEDIA if this war is kind of resolved and the tariff thing is a little bit more predictable and supply chains, although I'm here a little bit on supply chains challenges, but hopefully none of these major issues sort of, if they subside, I suspect there'll be kind of a lift in activity over the next 12 months, particularly in CEDIA and in the residential market.
Good. We look forward to hearing those rumors as they fly around the CEDIA show floor. So, Gary, this has been great. Really appreciate your time here. I think you provided a ton of value. This has been another episode of the Flywheel Effect. If you did enjoy this episode, give us a like, a follow. Hit that 5-star button on Apple or Spotify. If someone you think would find it useful, please give it a share. And until next time, this is the Flywheel Effect. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Flywheel Effect. Our journey through the intricate world of luxury home services continues to be fueled by your passion for excellence and innovation. If you found value in our conversations today, don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. More insights and resources. Visit us online at growwithvital.com. Until next time.